Mathilde, thank you for inviting me. I am well aware that I'm the last speaker of the day and you'll all have your heads overloaded. And I'm going to make things worse by talking about a problem that is of existential importance, which is the state of our planet. But I'm not really going to talk so much about the sort of the facts about our food systems and environmental sustainability. What I'd like to focus on a bit more is the values and assumptions and ideologies we bring to the evidence about what a sustainable diet looks like, because it's a very, very contested area, and that's what I want to explore. So Mathilde actually showed this slide at the beginning of the presentation. We know that the food system accounts for about 25 to 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's the major user of human land use across the planet. It is overwhelmingly the main driver of biodiversity loss. It uses 70% of irrigation water, which is increasingly in short supply, and I'll come on to the diversity issue in a minute. We also know that while our food system as a whole, from production through to processing, distribution, consumption and waste disposal, accounts for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, particular foods have disproportionate impacts, and I am sure all of you in the room will be aware that on the whole, and with some exceptions, animal products have a higher environmental impact than plant-based products. So we know this. This third slide, and my final slide on environmental impacts actually, is to my mind the most tragic and terrifying and shameful of all. We can see that of global biomass, most of the biomass of mammals on this planet are our creatures. There are our creatures that we have bred and reared and that we slaughter for our own purposes. And if you add that to the human population, you see how very little is left for wild mammals on this planet. So when we think about the environmental crisis we face, we hear a lot about climate change, and climate change is incredibly important, but we also have to think of the ultimate goals of climate change, and is that for human survival, or is that to create a livable, viable planet for the non-human world as well? And this is where values come in as well, because we can probably develop ways of living on a planet in a way that will keep us alive, but it may be at enormous cost to other species. And the question is that acceptable? So if we are returning to climate change, going to address our global commitment signed in Paris to limit the global rise in temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, then basically we have to change our diets. There is no way out of it. This study was done by colleagues of mine at Oxford, and it shows that if under a business as usual scenario, the food system on its own, if we did nothing else, would gobble up, would account for a 2 degrees rise in global temperatures. If we adopted a kind of healthy diet, then even that isn't going to do the job. That's the healthy calories, because it's still going to go above the 1.5 degree limit. And by the way, this means that there's no space for heating and lighting this room. It's no space for the flights that many of the presenters have taken to come to this event. It's no environmental space for the clothes that you wear, or the holidays you might take, or the pen and paper and computers that you might use. It's all used up by food. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to do a lot of things all at the same time. We need to change our production systems, we need to reduce waste, but we also need to address our consumption patterns. And given the global, the dominance of animal products, the disproportionate impact that it has on on the environment, and given the global growth in animal product consumption and the very high levels of consumption that we see in affluent countries in the global north, such as France, such as the UK, we just don't have a way forward that doesn't include dietary change. So, this is the question. Is it healthy? Is a low environmental impact diet compatible with health? And we have had the beginnings of some answers in the presentations that we've heard today, touched upon. I should say that this is an incredibly crowded field, and as academics do, they like to splice and dice and ask the question in lots of different ways and formulate different ways of looking at the issue. And so you might get people. This was a French study a few years ago, which looked at real-life diets of French people and clustered them in terms of their healthfulness and looked at whether healthier diets were more environmentally sustainable or less environmentally sustainable. And it came to the conclusion that, well, not necessarily, there is not a necessary correlation between healthfulness and environmental sustainability, partly because healthier people ate a lot of dairy products, among other things. And then they do linear optimization studies, which try and sort of factor in, how can we, for a specified amount of kind of nutritional requirement with some cultural and perhaps price constraints, depending on the study, can we rejig the diet to achieve reductions in environmental impacts? Another way of looking at it is to look at dietary guidelines across the world, and they vary slightly, and say, okay, which of these are more compatible with reducing our environmental impacts than others? And then there are other studies which say, okay, if we totally reconfigured the food system based on sort of circularity principles, so the idea that you reintegrate cropping and livestock systems, you don't bring in external nutrients such as mineral fertilizers, how much would we get to eat, and could we reconfigure it in ways that achieve our health goals? So lots and lots of studies, and there are so many more. Perhaps the most kind of well-publicised one, again it's been touched upon, came out a few years ago. A phase 2 is coming out as well, and this was a study which involved quite a lot of people, myself included, and it asked 2 questions. First it said, what is a healthy diet? And then it asked, what are the planetary boundaries? What are the kind of the kind of constraints within which our food production must operate across climate change, land use, water use, nutrient pollution, and so forth? Do the two fit together? Is a healthy diet also one that is environmentally sustainable? Now, in theory, those were 2 separate questions. In practice, it is impossible really to ask one without the other. And it came to the conclusion that, well, just about you can have a healthy diet that fits within those environmental constraints. And you can see that this is weekly, that it implies a complete refiguration of certainly the diets that you're going to find in the UK. Many, many more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more pulses and legumes and nuts, and a very, very reduced quantity of animal products, which you can see there, allowing that milk is about 10 kilos of milk go to making 1 kilo of cheese. For a cheese-loving nation, that's not such a lot of cheese. And although this looks very much less than people in the global north eat, it's worth remembering that if people in many parts of the global south were to consume a diet like that, it would represent an increase in consumption levels. So there is a contraction and convergence, a kind of fair shares equity issue there. But of course, and it wasn't a perfect study, I should say, there was kickback. So a lot of the concerns were around the nutritional adequacy of those diets, given the nutrient density of animal products and their easy, ready bioavailability. So those are some of the studies which really made the argument that diets that are reduced to that extent in animal proteins are and associated micronutrients are inadequate and that it particularly affects people like women, women and young children. So I'm not going to go into those studies in great depth, but I just want to make the point that in this sort of contested global debate around how we sit on this planet in a way that isn't going to trash, to destroy the underpinnings of our own existence, then the dispute is largely around animal products, not just how much, but of what kind, and of course for whom. So I think the results that we get, and there's a lot of debate in the UK, and it could be also within France as well, that the focus on the vilification of ruminants, of cattle, is misplaced because these recycle nutrients within the food system, that they can be reared on land that can't be used for crop production. There will be arguments that, in fact, if you get rid of animals in the food system, you are locked into high mineral fertilizer requirements, that you're fostering more monocultural systems, or there will be arguments that these systems are fly in the face of traditions, local cultures, and so on and so forth. And so the results are really, really different because I think people think differently about health. And I'm very minded that we've just had a presentation which is focused on the way in which large corporations sow the seeds of doubt in order to create confusion and in order to carry on doing what they do. At the same time, I do think it's really, really important to look at how and why there are genuinely different points of view on how we see what health actually is. So one very clear way of looking at the healthfulness of a diet is what the adequacy of inputs might be. And this is where lots of the accusations have been against the sort of low-meat diets, that they are going to lead to deficiencies in iron, calcium, trace elements, and so on and so forth. So that is one way of looking at health. Another way of looking at health is looking at the risk factors, and that could be on, the effects of a certain food, on sugar levels, on blood pressure, on the microbiome that we've heard today, and so forth. Or maybe you're going to look at health in terms of, okay, well, what happens to you? To what extent are you likely to going to get diabetes or cancer or osteoporosis? What are the chances of you dying? So that's another way of thinking about health, which is quite sensible in many ways. Other focuses of concern are whether people are looking at particular nutrients or particular foods, or whole patterns, whole dietary patterns. And we've heard from Carlos earlier today about patterns of diets, those that are higher in ultra-processed foods, those that are associated with kind of traditional food cultures. And then we hear about whether health is a matter of just what you eat, or whether it's about the production underpinning it. And so we've heard about pesticide exposure. So and so that's about production patterns, but also the increasing homogenization of the varieties of crops and livestock that we're actually eating. So that diversity of different kinds of wheat, or different kinds of cattle, or whatever it is that we consume, has dwindled. And then, of course, the who is doing the producing and why they are doing the producing. So health is, depending on who you ask, it is measured and viewed in lots of different ways, but it doesn't end there, because then you have to think about the health of the whole person. So over lunchtime we were talking a lot about health and healthiness, and we were also discussing the fact that the rise in eating disorders, and the fact that you can have the healthiest possible diet, but if it creates stress, and if it disconnects you from society, from other people, from the norms and traditional ways of eating that bring you together, then that itself may not necessarily be healthy, because you are your mind as well as your body. So if you zoom out and look at health in that way, then you may draw different conclusions about what a good healthy diet might look like. And then there's the role of societal health. And again, In France, it's perhaps stronger than it is in the UK, but there's very, very strong emphasis on cultural traditions and the continuity thereof, and of cohesion and identity. So that's a more collective way of thinking about health, the health of our heritage. And then there's, of course, the fact that the determinants of health include, do you have a job? Do you have a well-paid job? And that itself, given that the food system is such a major employer, that's another aspect of it. And then there's questions of healthfulness in terms of power and agency. You know, I could eat a really, really healthy diet that is presented to me, and all I need to do is eat it, but I have no control. You know, this is one of the critiques that many who are talking about ultra-processed foods say, agency has been taken away from the individual and placed in the hands of large corporations. And even if they magically reformulated their food so that it would tick all our nutritional boxes, and yet I have no agency, this cannot be a healthy food. So that's another way of looking at it. And then finally, the planetary health, and it doesn't get enough attention, that without a planet, we are nothing. And not only that, but there is more to life than us. And it is the question of what our values are here. Are they extrinsic values about personal survival, or they are more biocentric? And how do we think about you know, the needs of the non-human world? So those are some ideas, the way of thinking, but there's more that goes into it. So you know, again, if I read different literatures or I talk to different people in the room, you know, some people are all concerned about the fact that we're all kind of dying of overconsumption and, you know, non-communicable diseases associated with that. For others, the problems are still persistent micronutrient deficiencies. And of course, they're terribly disentangled, but people do place different emphases on these different particular problems. And again, it's the obesity as opposed to micronutrient deficiencies. Again, is the goal optimal versus good enough? Again, there's been one of the big contestations when it comes to livestock is questions about how much protein do we need. And there's been a lot of kickback from people who are associated with perhaps the livestock industries who say current nutritional requirements of 0.83 grams of protein per kilo of body weight are understating the problem. We actually need more protein. Look, meat is very bioavailable, it's very digestible. You know, we are not going to meet our nutritional requirements, you know, without having more meat. And it's about this idea of an optimal body. And we hear it also with sort of personalized nutrition as well, to be the best possible version of ourselves, as opposed to thinking, well, you know, there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet. What's a good enough diet to keep us more or less alive while keeping space for other creatures? Again, what is your priority here? And then, which links to the idea of, is the goal to optimize the health of the individual or the collective? And when I think about the collective, we have to think again about the non-human world. And then finally, what's the assumed counterfactual? So we hear this a lot in discussions about veganism. So one of the debates is that if we cut back on meat, we will be cutting back on wholesome traditional diets of meat and many vegetables, etc., and be eating all these ultra-processed vegan junk foods. So that is the assumed counterfactual of people who might critique arguments for a reduction in animal products. An alternative counterfactual by those who are arguing for that shift away from animal products is that people will be eating more nuts and legumes and fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So depending on what you're assuming might happen, you're going to judge a course of action accordingly. So it is all about values, and I think other ideas come in about how we see time. So do we think that the solutions lie in the past? We've heard a lot about the need to return to traditional diets, but we have also heard a lot about the kind of more precision life sciences approaches to at least identifying associations and ways forward. And I think different people place different emphases on these, and they also place different emphases on the idea of naturalness and whether something being more natural is inherently and necessarily good. And of course there's a ton of contradictions here, as we all know, that we may say that certain things are more natural, but we've also heard that, you know, there are toxins in the natural world, and, you know, I'm sure all of us in the room have queued up for our COVID jab, and so on and so forth. We are unnatural creatures, and so we're full of contradictions here, but they riddle discussions about food. And I think for me the most important question is what we do about trade-offs. If we can't afford a healthy diet, a really optimally healthy diet, then what do we do? I know what my answer is, but I'm sitting in the very privileged global north, and I have been very lucky all my life, but my feeling is that we therefore have to make do. And if that means that we have to fortify every so often to compensate for the, you know, I think we could all more or less manage a healthy diet that that is very rich and in diverse plant-based foods, but it may need propping up here and there with some fortification. That's my personal view, because I feel that the kind of planetary imperative is a non-negotiable. Others may form a different judgment, but I do think what's at the heart of it is people's values, because health and sustainability are political and moral questions as well as a matter of kind of science and facts. So, and of course it's a matter of money. Where do we direct our time, thinking and research efforts? So that's the kind of health side of things, but then we have to think about change. So how do we think about, we've heard all about the problems today, and we know that the influences on diets are fantastically complex. We've heard about, you know, the kind of commercial determinants of health. There's also, you know, we have the small biology, we have access, affordability, availability, we have knowledge and education, we have the food environment, which is so much more than just what's in the shops and what's advertised to us. It's the lobbying that goes on behind closed doors that we've heard about. But we have demographic trends, we have research and development funding, we have trade agreements, we have legal frameworks, and then we have all the kind of extra food influences on our consumption patterns, which might be about the security of our jobs, and the wages we earn. It might be about the kind of the paradigms within which we work. So we've heard lots of discussion already that, you know, about how capitalism and the growth imperative that pretty much shapes the way we think about the world. Whether we like it and whether we overtly kick against it or not, it's still very intractable. So the points of intervention there are unclear. There's lots and lots, you know. I think Mark talked about Everything Everywhere All at Once, that very good film that came out last year. You know, we need to be doing lots of things all at once, but different people place different emphases on different aspects of change, and I think that partly depends on your disciplinary background, whether you're an engineer or a philosopher, whether you're an arts graduate or a neuroscientist. That will inform what you feel about what the problem is and how change might happen. It will also influence the scale of intervention, whether it's at a very small scale level, like an intervention in the gut, or whether it's, you know, dismantling the World Trade Organization. It will inform your view of where the appropriate context of consumption is. So is it public procurement policies in schools? Is it online marketing? Is it workplaces and the way we think about catering arrangements at conferences? What is the focus of intervention? And who is the agent responsible? So again, the UK loves to put the blame on the individual, you know, weak, self-willed individual, whereas because that pretty much gets government and industry off the hook, the campaigners point their blame in other directions and argue that there are others who are responsible for change. And then, so that implies different levers of change. So if we focus on the individual, then all we need to do is inform them and they're going to somehow go and do the right thing. If we think, well, that hasn't worked so far, then we need to look at other ways of, other levers of intervention, which implies a role for example, regulation. And then we have to think about different moral mechanisms. Again, the green movement has dithered over time, changed its mind, whether we get people to change by saying, look, this is cool, this is aspirational, you know, here's a Toyota Prius and you can be, you know, just like Leonardo DiCaprio, or by saying, you know, every time you eat a steak, you're killing, you know, you're killing Amazonian species, or you're causing, you know, the kind of moral arguments for change, and different people will argue for different approaches. And then, of course, there's the logic of change. I mean, we're academics. Somehow we think that if we throw more knowledge at a problem, somehow change will happen. We have also discussed the limitations of that we need to act in the absence of evidence. So what are the other ways of thinking about how change might happen? And then finally, are you a utopian or are you a sort of grim realist? Because that, again, is going to, you know, yes, we should get rid of capitalism, but in the meantime, what should we do? So different, you know, and there's a role for both. And so this just leads to questions about what change we think is legitimate. So many within the NGO sector, many of the talks that we've heard about today have said, you know, we need regulation, there's a role for government. But then if you go talk to people who are perhaps more persuaded of the power of markets, they will say government should stop interfering and distorting the market. We need to empower the individual to change, or we should stop blaming the individual. Again, different slants on the same question. And again, the role of market mechanisms is at the heart of a lot of disputes. And then again, we see the questions of what changes around incremental change as opposed to radical change, you know, being necessary, but also how do you do it? And then what really counts as change? And again, if we all do the right thing but for the wrong reasons, is that really change? You know, I think of, for example, if you were to pay your children to do really well at school and to study hard, would that really be, and they did very well, would that be a solution? You know, different people will have different answers there. So this just leads me to pretty much my last slide. I think there are many different visions of what a good food system looks like and how we get there. And I think what we're seeing at the bottom right is the traditional approach, which is that, you know, people like all these delicious foods, and what we can do as corporates is give them their delicious foods with less impact, which might mean lower environmental impact. It might mean product reformulation and substitution. It might mean dealing with the after effects by giving them drugs. And it might mean by placing the onus of action on the individual by labelling stuff. Another way of looking at change is saying, okay, well, what we need is much, much better and more precise information, and a very, very personalised nutrition approach. And at the same time, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, reduce our land take, and go for approaches that use as little land as possible to deliver these optimised nutritional packages in the least environmentally damaging way. And very strong motivation for this sort of alternative protein, cellular agriculture approach is also motivated by animal rights arguments. You know, when you bear in mind, my figures are always out of date with this, but we're talking about 80 billion terrestrial animals slaughtered each year, and the figures are always out of date because they always go up. You know, if we eliminated that by means of producing meat in labs, that would be a solution. Another way of saying is, yes, but animals are really good at recycling nutrients. They are part of traditional systems. We need to rebalance our diet so we're eating less meat but better meat. We need to address the kind of concentration of power in the food system and go back to smaller, more diverse mixed systems, which are very much predicated on the idea that we can change our systems of production, our power mechanisms, and that we as people are going to be willing to accept and to be part of these changes. And then right at the top, we have an approach which takes animals right out the system and says, well, actually, we don't need to cause animal suffering. We can not only change our diets in ways that kind of speak to the more kind of traditional consumption patterns and spare lots of land for nature, but we can also do it in a way that causes no animal suffering. So I think these different visions of what's possible and what's desirable very much inform our discussions about what we want for the future. So when I ask the question, is a sustainable diet compatible with good health? And I think my answer is, well, you have to figure out that answer for yourself. I think it is, but I think my definition of health is perhaps more collective in orientation, that it perhaps encompasses the top left, a little bit of that one, the techno-salvation, and a little bit of that one, and there's no room for that one. That's my personal take on good health. Thank you very much.